Recording. Okay, guys. So as planned, after our previous two meetings on the last book of Logics of Worlds, the idea was to do, for the first time, more political interlude. And I thought it was a great opportunity to also present something that Dennis and I have been working on and off for a long time together. Actually, I think about 4 years explicitly. And we actually had, I think we had some important breakthroughs recently, especially because until recently, we always thought the last thing we understood from the book was the important thing about it. And now that I think we have a larger overview, it's easier to see the connections, I think, between a bunch of stuff. We separate, like, I don't think we can cover all of this, especially point 4. And I also think we shouldn't worry too much about 1 and 2 here, right? About these things, because everyone who's here is also joining the Monday meetings, and we've been discussing the sort of general objectives of this project, and we're kind of about to publish a text that actually has a summary of these previous works, but we added some stuff on this as well. I think that this point here, and Dennis, please interrupt me at any point. I think this point here is useful because if this here, to understand this, you just need to read that outline, and there's already material there. This second point here, I think the only place we treated it before was in a meeting I presented on Monday on Karatani and social worlds and we never really got to discuss the minutiae of this issue because there are some specific conditions, some specific things I think we are changing and or fine-tuning with regards to how Badiou discusses politics that changes a bit how this interpretation or this way of using his philosophy is mobilized. And then we separated a bunch of stuff from Capital that we want to go over. It kind of follows the order of the chapter. So chapter 1, and then section 3 of chapter 1, chapters 2 and 3, chapter 4 up to 6 concerning the formula of capital, the chapter on the production process, and then the beginning of the discussion of surplus value and so on. So it's kind of a step-by-step construction of the kind of first 10 or 8 chapters, I think. And mostly it actually follows quite closely the logic, I think. I was a bit surprised how kind of consistent with the way Marx presents stuff, our construction actually ended up being like, so there's something, I'm not sure exactly about, I think we'll probably end the meeting, I imagine, when we get to this part here on surplus, which is where both the production part and the discussion on surplus value, I think we're still kind of talking about and seeing what's going to happen there. So we have some stuff, but I think it's a bit less consistent than what comes before. And I think we can have a general, the beginning of a conversation about this, but it's also very loose and we don't have that much stuff here.
Yeah, I think since we've just been just immersed in this stuff for the last few months, right? Studying the Badiou in the Badiou group and also in the Marx political economy group, it's possible that we're just like we're making too much sense of things because it's just what we've been living, breathing for a while now. So I think one way to take a step out of it is to kind of measure it by what problems, like we should always be asking ourselves, what problems does this solve in the reading of Marx, right?
Yeah.
There's certain problems that Marxists have been struggling with for a long time, and hopefully this strategy that we're adopting is a way of approaching those problems in a different way, right?
Yeah, I think that it's a pity that we didn't have a chance to do this. Like, I wouldn't know how to do it, to be honest. But I think that, for example, to turn this, it already starts looking like a big project, as you guys can see. But I think that the thing that would really make it consistent is if we could add here, with clarity, a sort of outstanding problem, you know?
Yes, yeah, that would be really important. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we turn this into a text, I think it should.
Yeah. For example, things that I think we can already mention, right? That we talked about here already. I think that the whole point about the critique of political economy being incompatible with the theory of political organization, that's a big objective we are mentioning here, right? I think actually if we go to the next slide, there is already something on this, right? So I think that it already starts dealing with this, right? The idea of the bridge between political subjectivity and economic structure, right? I think that another way of formulating this is to say, I think we mentioned more than once, right? That there is a sort of overemphasis on the structural on the side of the critique of political economy, and the term under structural determination is too moral, too subjective. Our discussions on political organization in general, right? I think that Renzo found recently a text that begins with a very nice formulation that I think encapsulates this problem. When the author says, we know how to identify radical agents, but we don't know how to identify radical action, right? This idea that you can, actions that are radical in their effects, implying that you need to know their structure, we have a hard time recognizing, while agents that claim themselves to be radical, identifying that way, it's much easier. So that's not how we work with the critique of political economy. Things are not what they say they are. We look at how they act. So why can't we have such a theory also for political organization? I think that's one of the points, right? So if I were to add problems here, I would say the first one concerns this. Why the concept, like having no common theoretical background for both the way we think about organization and the way we think about economy, and the challenge to turn economy into almost like a large organization and organization into something like a small economy, something like this. The second problem that I think we already mentioned also is an outstanding problem in Marxian theory, which is the relation between value and price. We have, which is also, let's say, can kind of be thought in terms of Marxian political economy seems to talk about something transcendental, structural about capitalism, but not be able to account for empirical, day-to-day situated functioning of prices and the way that we actually deal with prices, which microeconomy and neoplastic economy seems to be better at. So there is the whole transformation problem issue, which I think it's also something we want to be able to address somehow, right? I think a third issue that is good to have in mind that we by chance touch upon is that there is a big, let's say, philosophical tension in Marxism today concerning two big interpretations, I'd say, or more, but at least they are relevant, is that one considers labor to be ontologically grounded. So labor is the very thing that makes the being of humans and so on and so forth, right? So labor is something that has some ontological ground. And there is another one which considers labor to be a category of capitalism and to be a derived category from the structure of value, commodities, and so on. There isn't a trans-historical theory of labor. So labor is more logical, right? And they don't really get together. And people who think about labor in an ontological way tend to have a more, let's say, direct investment in workers' movement, because no matter what happens in capitalism, the workers should be an entry point to see something more profound or kind of subtracted from this world, whereas these other guys tend to be more apolitical. In fact, either they tend to look for political agents elsewhere, or even to say that there is no possibility anymore, because labor is purely a capitalistic concept in itself, right? So there is a sort of tension, and it doesn't really go anywhere these days. So there's also something I think we can talk about. Perhaps there are other problems we can name here, but I think that this tree, one that is, let's say, concerns the relation between political economy and communist strategy, one that concerns, let's say, a possibly poorly formulated economic problem in Marxist theory, we might point to something symptomatic, and one that concerns a sort of spontaneous philosophy of politics within Marxism. I think they're all problems that are interesting to have in the back of your mind as we go, because one way or another, I think we managed to address them. Though today, I think some of them won't really be appearing, but still, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, we gave a sense, summary here of the text we already wrote on this sort of project, and this sort of on this exact project, but I suggest that we actually skip this just because you guys have access to a kind of a handout with this larger summary, and the texts are also available. Though I think it might be good at some point to revisit them and perhaps discuss them if they're interests anyone. I think that since we are probably short on time, considering everything we prepared, perhaps we should move along, unless anyone wants to comment anything. I don't know.
I just have a question about the previous, the points that you brought up. So Dennis mentioned that like in order to avoid reading too much into the relationship of Badiou and Marx, we need to put some guardrails by saying that exactly what problem are we thinking to address by linking these two thinkers together. Is there, and the problems that you mentioned, three of them, which are very technical problems related to Marx, that we hope logical worlds or generally Badiou's framework can address. But is there a question of a general destination of communism and the worker movement, because Badiou has distinct thoughts about that, or like a comparison between what they think about communism? Is there something related to that we can put as a guardrail in this discussion?
Yeah, we prepared a slide on this because I think that the same way that we are departing from Marx, like there is here you have capital, right? And we are proposing a move from capital towards something else. And here is Badiou and his stuff. And we're actually proposing a move out of it. And I think this move has two aspects. One aspect is a restriction, in the sense that we are not talking about worlds in general. We're talking about social worlds, and not only social worlds in general, we're talking about capitalist worlds. So you need to have more information, more restriction to be able to define why this is specific and this is general. I think that's the first move out of Badiou we're making. This is not simply saying, look at Badiou, right? And second, I think it's also a critique of Badiou's own, I would call it like a contextualization, right? Of Badiou's politics, because Badiou is, there's no politics in logics of world. It doesn't describe politics. It describes this general thing. But Badiou has his preferences for politics, and I think that he thinks, like you can see in his examples, that there are very specific kind of underlying commitments. So, for example, I think, and that's why we added here, there seems to be historical and contextual reasons capable of explaining why Badiou only explores political examples in philosophy where the autonomy of politics is posited against the structure of economy. So, for example, it's the 68 movement of students together with workers organizing beyond trade unions and party politics, right? Or it's Mao Zedong choosing not to opt for the Soviet route and say, we need to revolutionize the party from within by creating a new alliance with the peasants and not choosing alliances based on class, but based on political action. So his examples of novelty, they are very dependent on the sort of rupture from economic thinking and political economy that was characteristic of a time and place. Does this mean that we're forbidden or inconsistent with his system if we approach it totally differently, considering other underlying conditions, right? That does, guys, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, my microphone was, my sound was cutting. So I think that the greatness of his project is not only that you can propose this sort of formal restrictions, right? Moving from the abstract theory of worlds to something more specific, but you can also recognize, because he has the machinery for this, what is proper to Badiou as a militant and where that ends and something else begins. Because the theory of conditions, the theory of worlds and all of that, it can be used for something else that he didn't think of. And I think that that's a bit what we're doing. So you won't find, I think, any direct connection between Badiou's political wagers, like what he puts his investment in, like I believe in this and that, this can do something, and what we're proposing, like there are some differences that are quite profound, I think. Right, I think this question here, can there be an economy within a body? So can you think a novelty that is, which is synthesized in the form of an new economic system, and not simply in terms of a collective body of militants, right? There is absolutely no word about this in Badiou, explicit, but it's not inconsistent, we think, with his project. So on the one hand, it is very much indebted to him, but it's not like a reading that is glued to the letter of his text and to his own political personal positions, you know. And I think that there is a difference there too, because Badiou was part of a moment that the Chinese Revolution was a sort of template for France. This idea of political positions being more relevant to define a commune or a revolutionary moment than class positions. That was kind of a proposition that wasn't invented by the French movement he was part of. It was very much a Chinese invention, I think. And we are not living that moment anymore. Like, so the sort of basic underlying principles we're working from, I'd even say that they're much more fragile and therefore also much more experimental than his. Like he had quite a conviction on, like he was kind of surfing that wave, whereas we're still kind of trying to tie together some principles that are not so well established, right?
Mm-hmm. I would just add to this also that I feel like depending on what your position is on what the world is that we're currently in, right? The world you define, the world you build will determine your strategy for change, right? Mm-hmm. And Badiou kind of outlines the relationship between the structure of the world and the change, like what change would look like in that world. So I think, I mean, that's what Marx has in common with Badiou as well, because Marx spends his whole project looking at capitalism, not inventing communism, right?
Yeah.
But it's because understanding the world of capital is exploring the space, and then therefore you can determine what is really different from that. How would you identify a communist solution to the problem of allocating resources? Well, first you have to determine what is the capitalist solution to this problem, and then also Badiou's the second half of Logic of Worlds is entirely kind of a theory of novelty, which I think that's why pairing the two is very important, because I think Badiou offers a more comprehensive theory of change. So once we establish what is the world of capital, I think we can utilize that theory of change a bit.
Yeah, but
right?
I would even go further than that, Dennis, because I mean, one thing that I think Badiou does that is very good is that he has the general strategy of reading Marx as being a guy who's first committed to a certain communist hypothesis, and because of this commitment, political commitment, he looks at the world in a certain way, right?
Yes, yeah, that's important too. Yeah.
So, for example, I think that the one way of talking about Marx and capital is thinking like this: the guy, he describes very nicely in the beginning. I wish we had actually used this quote. Like, actually, why not? I think that this is so relevant. Like in the beginning of contribute. This is the worst title. Preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. In the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, look at this description. If it doesn't sound ridiculously like the sort of kind of conversion in the road of Damascus that Badiou is so fond of. If the internet helps, it would be good. He says here, although I studied jurisprudence, I pursued it as a subject subordinated to philosophy and history. In the year of 42-43, as an editor of this journal, I first found myself in the embarrassing position of having to discuss what is known as the material interest. It was the question of the theft, forest thefts, and division of landed property, right? And he says, so this caused me to turn my attention to economic questions. On the other hand, at that time, when good intentions to push forward often took the place of factual knowledge, an echo of French socialism and communism, slightly tinged by philosophy, was noticeable in the journal, the Rheinische Zeitung. I objected to this dilettantism, but at the same time, frankly admitted in a controversy that my previous studies did not allow me to express any opinion. So look at this, like the guy sees himself in a position that this comes to the material issue or economic question comes to the fore. And there was already an interpretation of this. The good intentions to push forward of French socialism and communism, they were all noticeable. So you see, like you have a problem, but he takes the problem so serious that he's able to say that the solution is not up to the task, right? So it's not that he formulates the problem once you have the knowledge. He first had the problem, he could see that the knowledge available at the time was not good enough, and then he goes to study, right?
That's really important.
Yeah, I really like this sort of encounter with something you don't know how to, you know it's crucial, you should be able to do something about it, but you still don't have the means to do it. But that you neither go with the conservatives nor with the progressives, right? So I think that's quite relevant in this idea, but ultimately because it suggests, I think that's Badiou's point, that Marx kind of he brings from his previous background a certain kind of theory of change, which is called dialectics. And he brings a certain hypothesis, the communist hypothesis, the continuum hypothesis, right? And with these two things, he kind of constructs the capitalist world in a way that something else can happen, right? But this is constrained by these things. Like nobody thinks about the value form the way that he does if you're not already committed to something prior, right? And I think that this is the place where Badiou comes in our project, and this is something that he doesn't come in. Like our hypothesis is that you can rethink capitalist problems in a larger space where it becomes particular, and we do have like the means to formalize a system, formalize a theory in those terms by using Badiou, right? So Badiou would come here, and our own political engagements come here, I think, right? And that's why this looks a bit different than Marx. And I think that the first big difference is that if you read Capital and if you read Marx works, it's always like the best you get in terms of communism is to say that something here is ambiguous and it might lead to a contradiction that could allow it to be repurposed in some other thing you don't know what it is, right? And I'm not sure if this is the strategy that is slowly appearing as we progress. Like it's a slightly different strategy that I think is also we're mobilizing, right?
Yeah, I think just not to spend too much more time on that question, but I think we can offer something new in this presentation regarding the idea of abolishing property, because I think we are giving, in some sense, a phenomenological twist to the notion of property. Mm-hmm. So we're reading property as a phenomenological thing, right? So to when we say abolish property, like what does that mean? I think that's something we can work on here.
Yeah, that's a nice point. I think that we shouldn't spend too much time on this here, but yet I think people who are interested in developing this idea that there is an underlying reason why Badiou's objective phenomenology is kind of consistent or compatible, or at least, let's say, sort of natural ally to Marx's critique of political economy. I think that I tried to give a bit of a background on this previous presentation, which tried to trace the sort of change in the meaning of world and how it kind of divided between the subjective phenomenology of world, which is how worlds appear to us, and the sort of objective theory of worlds, where worlds appear to themselves, or they're more defined by the internal logical consistence of a space than by the fact that it consists for me, right? And I think that we can look at how this has some bearing on the way that Marx presents things, and I think it will become clear as we go. There are many quotes that justify this. That probably we should look at the reference in the inverse order. Badiou ends up writing an objective phenomenology because he's informed by Marx, rather than this being a casual thing, because the connections are way too explicit, I think. I think we have a quote here. I think this quote here, I mean, I think we shouldn't read all of them, but I really like this quote from the preface of Capital, because since we've been tracking the problem of scale in several contexts, and we began dealing with it in Logics of Worlds, it's nice to see it kind of reappear here in a weird way. Two elements appear here, which I find interesting. One is that it clearly says that, well, we begin with the most difficult part is the analysis of the value form. It's very elementary and simple, but the problem is that we never got to the bottom of it. Though we have more successful analysis of the composite and complex forms, because the body as an organic whole is easier to study than the cells of the body, right? you need some sort of mediator like microscopes or chemical reagents to get to the cell and to touch, to make it intelligible, whereas the sort of composite view is more immediate, right? And for him, the force of abstraction must replace both the microscope and the chemical reagent in this analysis. So there is a correlation here with physics that he continues in the next paragraph. So both here he brings the idea that you need a mediation to see, and the idea that physicists either observe physical phenomena where they occur in the most typical form and most free from disturbing influence, or whenever possible, makes experiments under conditions that assure the occurrence of phenomena in its normality. And he claims that he studied Britain because of this. So in this work, I examined the capitalist mode of production and the conditions of production and exchange corresponding to that mode. Up to the present time, their classic ground is England. So there is also the idea that there is some sort of, there is something that is bracketed out, right? And there is some effort to find the conditions under which something is intelligible. It's not given immediately for us, right? So there is all this idea of, look, this doesn't emerge for us. We're not analyzing phenomena in the sense of things we sense or see, but rather that there are many mediations or some weird strategy you need to make in order to make these things intelligible, right? There is a ridiculously long quote here with many nice points, which is just the beginning of the book, which I think is nice to see the sort of strategy that he makes to suggest that this is the phenomenology of something that is not sensible, right? He begins with this idea that wealth appears, right? It presents itself as immense accumulation of commodities. The unity is a commodity, right? And then he says, like, at first sight, exchange value seems to be just a quantitative relation that is something accidental and purely relative. And the idea of intrinsic value inherent in commodities seems a contradiction in terms, right? I mean, if I exchange something for something else based on some convention we make right then and there, the idea that all these conventions, I exchange A for B, somebody else exchanges B for C, that doesn't mean I can also exchange A for C, right? There is no consistency between these exchanges necessarily. And the idea that there is something here seems like a contradiction. And then he says, yeah, but if you look at things more carefully, you will see that the very equation that we make between, let's say, a quarter of corn with some amount of iron, it tells us that there exists in equal quantity something common to both, that the two things must therefore be equal to a third, right? Each of them, insofar as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third thing. We don't know what it is. And he makes some illustration with geometry, right? So you see, like, it's an idea of moving from the sort of accidental initial perspective. We already moved from the analysis of the utility to the act of exchange. So stop looking at the thing and look at what happens when you relate it to something else. But then he's already trying to get to this common something, which is kind of objectively there, right? Inherent in commodities, that you can only see it kind of looking awry, right? Not really looking directly at something. Just to kind of contextualize this idea of a sort of phenomenological strategy. He's not trying to simply say what it is for you. On the contrary, there is something he's trying to kind of make you more intimate with, a certain way of approaching this, that abstract things in just the right way so that it makes something else intelligible, right? This intelligibility here concerns this common something, which will be value, right? I think also the thing we should mention is that, as we said, like, if there is a sort of, like, we're departing from capital on one hand and departing from Badiou on the other, and we already mentioned the sort of restrictions that it takes to come this way, right? From worlds in general to capitalism here. oh my God, what did I just write? To capitalism. One thing that is helping us do this is the sort of intermediate step that Karatani helps us to make with the idea of social worlds, right, or historical worlds, which he defines in this way, right, by the sort of imbrication between capital, nation, and state, and the way that he develops all these modes of exchange, things that we also discussed in other meetings, right? And I think Ben is also added here that it's not only this, but in Karatani is much more explicit. Let's say it's not a hidden variable, the fact that modes of exchange concern scale-dependent operations, right? He talks about, let's say, how worlds can get bigger and smaller, and depending on how much stuff it fits, what is the boundary of a world, what it can integrate, what it cannot integrate. Something that in being an event is quite, in Logics of World is quite kind of abstractly and formally described, and in Capital is not so explicit as well. So it kind of helps bringing all of this together, I think, dealing with this, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, it's not a smooth transition from Badiou to Karatani, because Badiou doesn't really give you a notion of combining worlds necessarily, although we've speculated on this a lot in our meetings, you know, the whole aspect of like extending the transcendental or extracting different metrics from the same transcendental.
Mm-hmm.
But that's always implicit in his work and not something he himself addresses. Whereas it seems like to adequately build a bridge from Badiou to Karatani, we do need that notion. We need a way of being able to kind of fuse worlds together, or consider a transcendental that can alternately function in like different modes, right?
Yeah, I think the modes is better than fusing worlds, right? Because I like the way we described it here. Like, this is actually our first, this is, here. I think this is the first kind of hypothesis we made as a sort of bridge between Karatani and Badiou. And I think that they actually clarify Karatani as well, right? Because Karatani's theory is about these modes of exchange, A, B, C, and D, and saying that every social formation is some mixture of these four, with one of them dominant, right? So we came up with a sort of way of approaching this within the idea of a transcendental, which is Badiou's idea of, let's say, the sort of structure of differentiation in a world, right? That kind of tries to account for this. So I think that it's helpful. We define the transcendental of a world to be composed of several modes of exchange, so A, B, C, and D, under dominance of one of them. That's the Karatani thesis, right? Social formation has a sort of imbrication of different modes. So we write, so the transcendental of A, transcendental of B, transcendental of C, and of D, the transcendental subsystems of each mode. So you imagine that you have a transcendental, right? And you can, we don't know exactly how to structure this, but it's almost like you can slice them and say this concerns the way that mode B exists in this world, right? Organizes this world. This concerns how mode A organizes this world. And we write T of C in the case of capitalism, right? The fact that in this transcendental composed of these four subsystems, this is the one that dominates. So with the superscript means that it's the dominating one, right? So what does domination mean? So following Karatani, we define dominance in terms of space and integrational capacity. So a mode of exchange is dominant if its limits coincide with the limits of the world in question. So for example, given that you are here in a world, by looking at, let's say, institutional relations, contractual relations of mode B, right, which for Karatani is the state, just to clarify, like this concerns gift, economy, this concerns contracts and states, this concerns commodity, and this concerns pretty much free association. So by looking at reciprocity relations, I can walk around in a world, but I cannot go everywhere. only paying attention to the differences in reciprocity. The same with mode B. I might be able to go here and go even further and consider all of this together, but there's still stuff I don't reach. We will say that T, that the transcendental C, is the dominant. If it is the transcendental, it is the mode of differentiation in this world that takes you the furthest, right? In fact, in the sense that it is from its perspective that you can never leave the world as well. I think that we'll manage to say a lot about this later on. So in Badiou's terms, we can say a mode of exchange is dominant if it guarantees the universal exposition of all relations, meaning that it is from its perspective that the world is logically complete, whereas the other ones don't really give you all of that. Finally, we think that one way to talk about the relation between these transcendental subsystems under dominance of one is by this theory called multi-layered network theory, which can be used as a basis for formalizing the transcendental of social world, since the transcendental of these worlds imply the existence of several forms of real atoms capable of localizing multiples in different ways. And this theory starts exactly from this idea. So like we'll go back to this many times, and I think Dennis did a nice kind of drawing of it here, right? So imagine like this is very basically defined that you have different modes of exchange, right? And you can actually, like one node is actually involved in all different networks. So you can see it here involved on like the blue network of contracts, the purple network of reciprocity. But so in this case here, it's localized on the contract transcendental, on the reciprocal transcendental, and on the commodity exchange one, right? So B, A, and C. And I think that the connection of this with the multi-layer network theory is very simple. If you think, for example, that you have some sort of, like you imagine a kind of a space of your relations on Facebook, right? And this guy here, A, is connected to some person B and some person C and some person D, like this here. And he's also in real life friends, for example, with only this person here, right? So you kind of rethink, depending on which kind of form of difference you're taking into account, you might be looking at this kind of personal network where he has other relations and so on, but you might also kind of re-atomize him on this level, right? And you can also think that even though on personal level, these two people are considered separately, on let's say as a juridical level, they actually have like a company together, so they're localized on one thing alone, and this company has some relation to something else. So we are able to talk about all of these different kind of ways of localizing these nodes and even kind of conjoining them into one thing depending on the layer, and define the dominant layer by the one that gives you the like that makes appear the most information about it, right? So for example, one example that we gave that I think works nicely is to think the difference between people who are have a lot of friends in actual life and also meet online. So most of your social network online, it's actually in reality, and there are other people you know in offline worlds, right, that are not represented in the online space. And the inverse situation where people have many more relations online, and it actually is much more defining of who they are. And outside, some of them they know, but you have actually less information about them by looking here, right? So in this case here, the Facebook transcendental might be dominant over the kind of other forms of relation, right?
Yeah. One way in that picture on the right, one way we can think of it also is can you make a path from any point to any other point if you were to remove one of these colored arrows, right? Like if you remove the blue arrows, I think, well, I don't know if it's correct on this one, but if you remove the blue arrows, you should be able to get from one point to any other point through the green. So it's something like that, where the green guarantees a certain cohesion to all the points. Or maybe another way to say it is any path from 2 points must go through the green. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly.
Yeah, I think that we're still looking for, I think that this here is actually not a multi-layered, it is kind of a projection of the multi-layered network, but it will have a problem, which is, for example, if this is person 1, person 2, person 3, since the transcendental and the multi-layered network theory don't depart from the substantial definition of nodes, but the logical definition, right? We don't know, it's not true that for every network, what counts as 1 is the same. As I said, so imagine that at one level, people count separately, like this is a person 1, person 2, but at a different level, they count as one thing, because here the logical relations make so that atoms are actually differently defined, and here they're individually defined. So when you project these two things, like this space and this space, into one flat surface, you tend to lose these arrows here, that they are transforming the identity of the atoms, right? And in this case here, you don't really get to see that, right?
Yeah, good point. It's too high dimensional to be drawn all at once.
Yeah, I think so.
In one layer, yeah.
And you can imagine, for example, it might be the case that as persons, they never get to participate in something that is very synthetic of the world. They only participate in a layer that, let's say, includes many aspects of the world. They participate as a different sort of atom that is not either a corporation or a person. So you see, like this theory, the nice thing about it is that, so just formally here, this is layer 2 and this is layer 1. Not only does it have the sort of graphs between nodes in a layer, and here as well, right? But it also has connections that are mapping from, let's say, A to A, right? It can change the identity of, here you're identified as a private, like a son or a daughter in a familial relation, and here you are a citizen in equal rights to your family. So for example, a very classic way of thinking about it is that, for example, from the standpoint of the state, if you're 18, you are like of equal, A and B are kind of like equal rights people. Nobody's responsible for anyone, right? But at the level of family relations, it's still the fact that this person is of an older generation than you. Right? And this might actually define the sort of relations that you have. So not everything needs to be preserved, right? You can lose things because the logic of what counts as an atom here and the cohesion of these atoms is defined internally by the modes. But we're still looking for the proper way to adapt this approach to transcendental to Badiou, which I don't think it's actually that clear, though it does seem like looking into this theory, you find many connections, right? So I think that this is the important kind of preface to what we're going to present. This idea of the transcendental of a world having several modes of exchange, having a dominant mode, in our case, TC. This is a hypothesis, right? Defining the domination in terms of the relations of the world. So the way, we'll see that this comes into the definition of money later on. Using this sort of intuitions from multi-layer network theory to navigate between ways of localizing things in this world, but finally saying that if the dominant mode is this one, we can still see the crucial like skeleton of the world by bracketing the influence of this other subsystems, right? So there's a sort of transcendental reduction of this big world to this particular subsystem of its transcendental. We're only going to be mostly analyzing the differentiation of things based on the commodity or the value transcendental, which does not mean that you could not unbracket this and reconsider how this structure we're going to discuss is actually re-atomized, re-localized once you see it from different perspectives, right? So I don't know, when you're looking at in terms of value, you will say that this commodity one here is valued less than this other one here. This is happening at this level, but that doesn't mean, for example, that considered from a personal perspective, whoever has this object doesn't value it more than this one, right? This might be the case from a gift perspective. Sure, this doesn't contradict what we're saying. It just means that we bracketed this analysis while acknowledging that if we want to see the world as a whole, if we want to get to the dominant organization of the space of capitalist worlds, this is not going to give us that, and this is going to give us that. Does that make sense until now?
Yeah, I think
I'll take the silence as a no, but okay.
The one with state and capital seems the most like clear, how like the market kind of abstracts away from the state, but at the same time you can't really have markets without state. So like to say that we're focusing only on TC, which is how maybe you could say how capitalism sees itself, all that capitalism depends on, right? It actually depends on all these other things.
I would even say,
see it.
Yeah, I would even say that we're actually looking at the intersection between TC and TA and TB, because we're actually going to be considered, for example, enclosures, social reproduction. These things are ways in which coding into one of these things allows it to be coded into this. So for example, if I'm a person at home, right, in a family, and we actually have a slide on this, like the family kind of looking from the gift, reciprocity, and kinship relations. I cannot sell my labor. I need to be indexed by the state as a citizen, as a property owner. This way, I can sell my labor as a commodity in the capitalist transcendental. So this is without this wouldn't be possible for the labor power. And actually, we will see that it's precisely on the points of the common that these two things tend to come into play the most, because this is what Karl Polanyi calls fictive commodities that need to be forced into the commodity form because they're not the product of commodity production, like labor, land, and so on. So without some additional confirmation, you don't get to localize it into commodity form, right? So we do touch on these other things, but it's always relative to the consistency of the value transcendental.
So just a quick question to for me to understand, whether I followed your conversation so far. It's very interesting. It's great, really. A lot of thought has gone into this. But the general scaffolding of this is that we are trying to basically create a frame to understand Marxist economy by two other frameworks. One framework is to take that discussion as a description of a mood to Gatani, and then apply Badiou's framework to understand each mode as a world, and then be able to understand the relationship of those modes as a relationship of different transcendentals with each other. Is that
Kind of, because it's, again, I really don't think the best way to think about this. Guys, can you hear me okay? The connection seems to be cutting.
No, actually, I couldn't hear you.
Okay.
The example Gabriel used.
Sorry, guys, I dropped for a second.
No problem.
No, Dennis, just for me to understand, is in your interpretation transcendental equate a world?
Yeah, every world has its own transcendental.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this case, when you say in a multi-layer, each layer has its own transcendental. So in Badiou's lingo, it means every layer in a multi-layer network correspond to a world in Badiou's terminology.
I don't think that's the case. Because again, like, you need to distinguish between modes as the thing that structure the world and modes inside the world. That's why we call it transcendental subsystem. Mm-hmm. Because it does need to be kind of coherent with the other. So reciprocity and gift giving in a tribe community has nothing to do with reciprocity in family relations in bourgeois ideology. Because bourgeois ideology already pre-conforms reciprocity so that it is cohesive with capitalist production. It has its own logic. Families remain partially autonomous from commodity production, but it's a difference between saying something like this, right? Sorry, the slides are going totally crazy. Like, it's a difference between saying something like, you have here the transcendental A, transcendental B, transcendental C. These are worlds, and then we want to kind of knit them together. But the fact is that once a mode dominates, it's also changing the way that these things are. So this is not tribal relations of reciprocity. This is specific family relations in capitalism. This is state in capitalism. So there is conditions for their compatibility when we say this, right? What is the dominant? So I think it's important. We need a new concept, which is the transcendental subsystem, which is like different from separate worlds, right?
Or something along the line of localizing the relationship described on one transcendental, localizing it according to another transcendental.
Yeah, exactly. So there is compatibility between them. So as we said, like, a company has some juridical existence according to contracts, and it's made of people who have even like other forms of relations concerning, gift giving, family relations, friendship relations, and so on. But I can actually, looking from the perspective of the company here, I can actually say things about these people. Like, it's compatible. It's not out of the world. I think, for example, we were talking about this in the class just now. Like, is melody, timbre, harmony, they have the same logic? No. Timbre has a different structure than melody, than harmony, than rhythm, or whatever, but they are compatible. You can still talk about them, but it's still different components that describe them, right? So you need to kind of cut it differently, and they make differences in different ways. But it's not like saying it's the world of rhythm versus the world of harmony. That makes no sense.
I think the issue there is because sometimes we confuse what the transcendental in Badiou is. Like, we think that transcendental is like an unidimensional grid or
exactly. Yeah.
And I think there's a whole bunch of problems there with this interpretation of what transcendental is, which is a problem of the second book of Logical Worlds. Like, and several different misinterpretations arise out of that.
Yeah. So, for example, Karatani never said that a mode exists outside of social formation. So, what actually exists is TA in a transcendental dominated by A, where you have this, right? Or TA such that it exists inside of this, or this. There is no such thing as the world of reciprocity in general. It only exists as related or dominated by some other mode. So there are no multiple worlds in that sense. They are, let's say, aspects. And they need to have some internal coherence that changes them. To be eternally coherent with an imperial form will change how commodity, reciprocity, and free association can appear. To be cohesive, to be compatible with reciprocity will change what can appear, and in fact, nothing can appear of the imperial form, how commodity can appear, and so on. So I think it's a good exercise, both formally, because we don't have the clear tools to do this yet. We don't know how to go about it clearly, both formally and kind of conceptually, to imagine this idea of a subsystem, a part of this multidimensional transcendental, right? That has some level of internal coherence and kind of dimensional coherence with the others, to such an extent that it makes sense to say, yeah, I can explore this world only from the contract perspective. I can explore this world only from the reciprocal relations. And this allows you to navigate it, but not fully, right?
Okay, but this problem is the problem between knitting together Karatani's work with Badiou's phenomenology.
Yeah, that's the issue.
Yeah, let's come back to the origin of the purpose of this presentation, which is Marx and Badiou. I'm trying to basically navigate this scaffolding that you're building. So we are fitting the problem, those three problems that you cited that exist with Marx, that we are trying to find an interpretation and suggest a resolution to those problems. Maybe we can probably see it in a different light under Badiou's framework. So the way that I understand that you are adopting Karatani's framework in order to restate the problem in Karatani's framework, and then you're relating Karatani's framework with Badiou's framework. So it is not a direct jump from Badiou to Marx. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's like capital is here, and rather than saying this is the transcendental of the world in general, we're using Karatani as a midpoint to say capital actually concerns the TC when the world is like this, but there are other stuff we're not looking into, and it's under these conditions that now we can bring Badiou in. And why is this also good? Because we're always, I mean, we mentioned this more than once, like the general strategy behind is to take capitalism and locate it in a larger space. Whereas this looks like a particular solution to something that could be solved some other way. So you need a bigger space. So you see, like, this is already a way to enlarge the space, to call capital a restriction on something larger. And then this something larger is also compatible with the theory, because we might be able to reconstruct this in different ways, right? The theory of a transcendental composed of these smaller parts is also the theory of, for example, the transcendental that has D as the dominant one. It's already cohesive with the theory. It's not two separate things. The theory of capitalism, and then we need something else, right? So underlying this strategy is already the idea of creating a framework that is rich enough to describe other things, right? That's actually a big problem in Marx, like it's a famous problem as well, that he has a theory of social formations that he describes, for example, with the idea of the contradiction between the forces of production and relations of production, which is, let's say, a bird's eye discussion of social forms, like primitive communism, feudalism, Asiatic despotism, so on, right? And then you have the theory of capitalism, which is a separate thing with surplus value and things like this. And the connection between the two is not always obvious, and seems like you need to take things from capitalism and generalize in order to arrive at this more detailed view of social formations or universal history. And I think that we managed to fine-tune that passage a bit just by making these preliminary comments, right? Because Karatani is very much concerned with perfecting that discussion, right?
I think the multi-layer network is also, I feel it's also really nice to have like a theory of distortion or of perspectives, like the way you bracket out a certain transcendental, you should be able to see, like, on the level, if you assume that the lines, the edges are like interactions. Once you bracket out one of the layers, you should feel like from a certain layer, what's called like ghost interactions in causality.
Yeah, perfect.
Certain layer, you should be able to see dependencies which are not caused within that layer, but are explained by something else which you cannot see from the transcendental you are. And also in the coarse graining problem, like that you were mentioning, of like this problem of identifying the same atom across layers. You could also have like the problems of not, if you're like too fine of a scale, you cannot actually make sense of relationships that is going on for like bigger atoms, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect point. Like this helps to discuss, for example, coarse graining as a sort of, for example, projection of one layer into another, which leads to distortions. But for example, imagine you have, this is pretty drawn, but imagine you have a layer that concerns, so reciprocal relations between groups, friends, nations, families, community relations, right? So you have some community here, and there is a foreigner here, right? And it makes no sense. This seems like a totally weird fact that he's trying to enter into your space from the perspective of communal relations. But from the perspective of commodity relations, the fact that he's actually labor power that is needed to make some means of production here productive and increase productivity here, or to make it a cheap production here, this becomes a ghost relation here, right? So here it makes no sense if you look at from this level. Only if you atomize things based on friend and enemy distinctions, this thing here looks like a kind of totally alien thing, right? You should be able to reatomize yourself on a different level where you're actually, for example, part of the working class with that person, and then suddenly the relations are clearer, right? So I think that there are many interesting things to discuss there. Like, I think that, for example, we can say that, let's put it like this, B, A, and let's say free association are all in some sense smaller than the value transcendental, but not only are they kind of, you can talk about the coarse graining of one into the other as if they are, there is a scale like this between them, but inside of each of them you can also distinguish, right? So for example, corporations and citizens, they're both different scales within one transcendental as well. So we preserve all the compositive relations of Badiou's theory of the object inside each one of them, as well as in this global sense, right? So you have, let's say, pluralization of the problem of coarse graining as well. You can talk about it in terms of what happens inside of a layer, and you can talk about what happens inside in terms of the relations between layers, right? like that's all a bunch of stuff we could develop further. So, but I think that this is our basic thesis of how to introduce this intermediary step into the analysis, right?
It's really nice.
So this is the beginning of the whole thing. So this is the only place that I think we're differentiating from Marx, which is to begin from the value form equation. So section 3 of chapter 1, rather than start from section 1 exactly. I think that in a certain sense, because Marx's theory of phenomenology is Hegelian in the sense that you move towards the intrinsic determination by starting from the immediate. It's not an axiomatic theory. You need to start with the discussion of, look at the commodity, it has many properties. Which of these properties are invariant and don't depend on you, on your perception, right? But we don't need to start from there because the actual theory of chapter 1 begins on the form of value, right? And it kind of just get this very short kind of summary. He says, commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles, goods, such as iron, linen, and so on and so forth. This is their plain, homely, bodily form. However, there are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility and at the same time depositories of value. They manifest themselves, therefore, as commodities or have the form of commodities only insofar as they have two forms, a physical or natural and a value form. Then he says that the value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition, right, into the composition of value. So the atom of value is not the substance of the use. You can turn and examine a single commodity by itself as we will, yet insofar as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, and that they acquire this reality only insofar as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, which is human labor, it follows as a matter of course that the value can only manifest itself in social relation of commodity to commodity. I think this statement here is the proof of an objective phenomenology in Marx. It follows because they only acquire this reality insofar as they are expressions of some social substance, of something, of this third something, that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity, which means that value does not appear to you, it appears to a commodity, right? So when you have a commodity and you have some idiot here, value is not this function. Value is this function. So I think that's a good statement of you need to look at the immanent relations between commodities to see value rather than look at the commodity as it appears to you, right? And he says, well, we all know that the commodities have a value form common to them all, which is their money form. And so we're going to trace the genesis of the money form. And we'll understand why he calls the common form the money form. I think that this will be like the first big crucial part, right? So we actually went through the whole three forms first, just as they appear in Capital, before we try to reinterpret them. But I think that one of the main points in this passage here that sometimes goes unnoticed, but that it becomes really, really, really crucial in our interpretation, is that, well, first he says that the whole thing, the mystery of the whole thing lies in its elementary form, right? And then he says, well, we have here two kinds of commodities, so linen and coat, which are his favorite example. And he says they play two different parts in this equation of some amount of linen equals to some amount of coat, right? And he says one part is called the relative and the other the equivalent form. And when you look at this formulation here, this asymmetry is not clear because the equal sign makes it seem like these things can simply be inverted, right? But when you look at this formulation here, it's clearer, right? 20 yards of linen, which is on this side, are worth This is not a mathematical equality. This is a predication, right? It's like is a coat, which is on this side. So one side is functioning as one sort of one logical place, and the other is functioning in a different logical place. They're not functioning the same way, right? So that's why he says that the second commodity is not the one whose value is expressed. The value of this commodity is expressed in terms of this commodity. That's why it's the equivalent form, right? You're using this commodity to say this one is like this one, but the inverse is not being said. It doesn't mean that the inverse is not true. It's just the inverse has not been expressed by this statement.
Yeah, we could just say that one doesn't imply the other, right? Like it's possible that we could swap them and it's true, but that implication is not guaranteed.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Yeah, but I also think that it's very important to take notice of this duality, right, between the equal sign as a sort of equivalence, because these two parts here are whatever proportion they are in. They are supposedly in a stable ratio, right? But on the other hand, this equality is also meaning this other form of relation, where there is an actual arrow for one thing being expressed in terms of the other, right? So we could call it, say, the formal analysis of this elementary form of value and the expressive analysis of the elementary form of value, right? And this will play a very, very important role as we move along. So the equivalent form, so this weird part here, the thing that doesn't get its value expressed, but is the thing in terms of which something else expresses its value, right? Figures as an embodiment of value, right? Therefore, a definite number of codes suffices to express a definite quantity of value in the linen. So no quantitative determination of its value gets expressed, right? And more than this, the use value, so the very body of this, becomes the form of manifestation, the phenomenal form of its opposite, which is value. So you get two properties already at this level, right? So the first thing that he said to us is, you don't get to see value by thinking about the individual commodity relation, but rather by looking at the commodity-commodity relation. And second, that in this commodity-commodity relation, which is a sort of logically consistent space, the very substance of this commodity, its bodily existence, actually comes into contact, like as a support to some logical existence, right?
Yeah, and this is nice too, because Marx makes it explicitly a requirement that things can't just appear on their own. They need a bodily support, right? Yeah. So the support of value is the body of another commodity. So there you have this kind of form of the dialectical postulative materialism at work already.
Yeah, I think that's also the reason to kind of go back to this point, because we'll see how that contradiction between the formal and the expressive, right, between the predicative and the sort of identity analysis, right, it will become the very bridge, I think, that makes the connection with Badiou very, very kind of natural. So from this analysis of x of y equals y of b, he moves to what he calls the total or expanded form of value, right, where you keep the one term, but now you compare it either to some amount of b or some amount of c or some amount of d. So you still want to know the value of this thing, but now you have, let's say, an infinite series of propositions, right? X of a is worth y of b, or x of a is worth z of c, or x of a is worth w of d, right? Just like you have here. And he says the value of a single commodity, the linen, for example, is now expressed in terms of a numberless other elements of the world of commodities. every other commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. The linen, by virtue of the form of its value, now stands in a social relation, no longer with only one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities. So you're kind of now getting a feel for not the exchange value of this thing with regards to another exchange value, but you get a feeling for its value with regards to the exchange value, right? So that's why you get a feel for its relation, its place in a world. And again, it's always by looking at the relations between these objects, right? Never by looking at how they appear for us. So it says at this point, it becomes clear that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their value, but on the contrary, it is the magnitude of their value which controls their exchange portions. And this is because the value of these things are being fixed, right, by this. This becomes clear that if you change this value, all this series of propositions need to be changed, right? Even if this remain. So the fact that this is determining this, the way that these things are defined, becomes clearer at this point. But this is the form of value that nobody cares for, the poor total expanded form of value. And he says, no wonder that he has actually a section saying bad things about it. He says the problem with this is that the relative expression of value is incomplete because the series representing it is interminable. Like this list here goes on and on for all commodities, n amount of the commodity n, right? You need actually an infinite list of propositions of the form. The value of this is some commodity, the use value of some object, right? You need infinite many of this, right? It is a many-colored mosaic of disparate and independent expressions of value. Also because, for example, I can now move this to the list, x of a, and fixate some other one, and do another infinite list where y of b is valued x of a, or z of c, or w of d, and so on and so forth. So you have an infinite list of infinite lists, right? For every commodity, there is a whole list of propositions that you need to account for its value. So its expression is an infinite series, is ever incomplete and deficient in unity. Because again, the same way that this form, as Dennis said, it is not guaranteed that the inverse is true or that the connection between many of these propositions are consistent. When you get these lists based on x of a, when the list based on y of b, the list based on z of c, we have nothing in these lists are guaranteeing that these things are consistent. So the unity is also deficient, right? So this is Marx's justification for what's the big jump, and I think it's like the big jump of the first chapter, and theoretically is a very complex thing to think about, usually not very clear, which is the inversion of the list. So it's not the fixation of a term on the relative side of the x is worth, and then you leave this variable open, but the inverse. You leave this variable open and you say is worth x. So you fixate the predicate, you don't fixate the subject. Right? So one coat or some amount of tea, some amount of coffee, so on, is worth always 20 yards of linen. So this is the fixated term, right? All commodities being equated to linen now appear not only as qualitatively equal as values generally, but also as values whose magnitudes are capable of comparison. By expressing the magnitudes of their value in one and the same material, the linen, those magnitudes are also compared with each other. The general form of relative value, embracing the whole world of commodities, converts the single commodity that is excluded from the rest, made to play the part of equivalent, here the linen, into a universal equivalent. I think that there is also a nice, like, this is not the gist of his argument, but there is a nice kind of distinction you could make here, perhaps kind of as an example between, you have, let's say, x of a contains like an infinite series of numbers, right? And saying something like this infinite series of numbers is equal to this, right? Belongs to this. Like this way you define the infinite set as a whole at once. And in this way, you can never really finish this list, right? So there's something like this going on when you invert. Now this whole thing forms a set. Everything gets expressed in this fixed term here.
Looks like he turned analysis to synthesis.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of what we're going to suggest. Actually, I mean, the way that we are thinking about this is that this is exactly how we move from phenomena to atom, or to phenomenal component. So you get the sense, you get the feeling now that the body form of the linen is now the form assumed in common by all the values of commodity. Right? So rather than having something like, and this is actually quite clear when we consider the expressive analysis we were talking about. So first we had something like X of A is worth Y of B, right? So there is, you can look at X of A, so at a subject from the perspective of this predicate, Y of B. But once you do this thing here and you fix the predicate, you can talk about the, let's say, the A-ness of everything in this list, right? How much A-ness does this have, right? It has X amount of A-ness. This will make more sense as we move along, but does this passage make sense to you guys? Like, is this clear?
Yeah, it is very clear. I mean, this is Marx's way to move on to the role of the money, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is clear.
Right. So I like this last part here in the quote as well. So the general value form, which represents all products of labor as mere conjugations of undifferentiated. This part with labor, we haven't discussed it yet. We'll get to it. Shows by its very structure that it is a social resume of the world of commodity. Sort of social resume. I find it a nice expression. Anyway. Yeah, so just to conclude his analysis of this, he says, what does he say? For some reason I can't read. So here he calls this money form the form D, right? And the universal equivalent form the form C. So gold is in form D, so it acquires the money form when it takes the place of what linen had in form C. The universal equivalent, right? The only progress from the universal equivalent, which is the fixation of a term here, to it becoming money, the only move, the progress consists in this alone, that the character of direct and universal exchangeability has now, by social custom, become finally identified with the substance gold. This is actually a little hint at the way that other transcendental, the transcendental B, will affect this particular commodity. So for example, if we're looking at the level of the transcendental C only, you saw how suddenly one commodity become the way that all other commodities are expressing their value. But why has it been fixated in one? Well, you need to look at another. You need to look at gold from the perspective of the state, and the fact that the state actually passes a law, for example, that fixates it and guarantees the exclusion of gold from some places, or the minting of coins made of gold or something like this, right? So that's like a way of talking about how, just an example of how these other aspects of the world, these other layers of this transcendental actually are conforming something to the structure of that as it appears for the value transcendental. So the elementary expression of the relative value of a single commodity, such as linen, in terms of the commodity such as gold that plays the part of money, is the price form of that commodity. So the basic definition of price is once this commodity has been established as money, so some amount of the money commodity, this is the form of expression of the price of Y.
Yeah, to add here something, the way I read this also is like, we're starting to treat commodities not only as commodities, but as properties of other commodities, right? Like you said, the A-ness of B and C and D and so on. So A-ness is a property, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we can then start to group or abstract together commodities based on their A-ness. So some commodities are left out of that. Like if I, just like in a propositional like logic where I say like, what commodities obtain for this property, right? What properties, what commodities will satisfy or fall under the property of A, and I will get, you know, magically through the principle of comprehension, I will get a portion of commodities from the world of commodities that fit that description.
Yeah, I think a good way of saying that is like, imagine here we have the property of having, let's say, $10, right? Yeah. This will give you a set, right, of a particular amount of B, not another amount of B. A different amount of B has been left out.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and some specific amount of C, but not another amount of C. Right, so it is actually partitioning. And if I change this property to the property $20, it would actually give me, for example, this, but not this. Even though this actually would be contained here in a certain sense, right? But
yeah, and that's what makes the price universal as well, is because I can, by adjusting my property of price, I can be guaranteed to grab everything eventually, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas that may not be true with, let's say, coffee, right? I could say, you know, 100 million pounds of coffee, but I may not find a commodity. I may not have complete reach of the world of commodities.
Yeah, it might just go stale in my some deposit because nobody wants to buy it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, not everyone wants to exchange for a million pounds of coffee. So it's the money form that gives you the widest range of this comprehension principle.
So you see, like, ultimately the guy used the simple commodity form, so this stupid thing, and the distinction between the sort of formal and the expressive kind of logics at stake here, right? To arrive at the money form, where you have this set here being equal to some amount of a particular fixed commodity, right? But you don't get here from here by simply looking at the equal sign. You need to be aware of this. Otherwise, the passage is impossible.
Just one question. Do you think does it make any difference that money doesn't have any basis on gold anymore for your analysis here, or I think doesn't have any difference?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, also because the way that gold, the only reason we're talking about gold is that he wrote it here. The only way we define, I think it will become clear in the next slides, but the only way we define, spoiler alert, the only way we define this is by saying it is the fixation of something here, right? Property one. And second, that we know that there is some level of influence of the state atom, right? The state layer. So the social customs, right? You can also have A here because, after all, currencies tend to be national, right? There is a work of these two layers on this third layer to turn the universal equivalent into something that gets fixated as the money form, right? But does it need to be gold? No. And I think that we will actually see something quite soon that explains why gold is accidental and not necessary. So kind of totally dismissing gold as a necessity and just extracting one condition which made gold relevant, but could make any other thing relevant as well. Mm-hmm. Also, I think that Marx doesn't treat this here, but what he calls social custom, and which he talks about in terms of the exclusion of a commodity, this is an enclosure. Like he talks about land enclosure, right? In primitive accumulation. He talks about dispossession when he talks about labor, right? So the transcendental of the state is necessary to turn land into a commodity. We know that the transcendental of the state is necessary to turn labor into a commodity. But here he's actually underlying this, giving us a theory that the transcendental of the state is also necessary to turn language or symbols or something that stands in logical relation to other things as a universal equivalent into a commodity as well. Mm-hmm. Right? So this is kind of in between the lines, but every time he talks about enclosures and social customs, we kind of need to unbracket our value transcendental and consider the interaction between it and these other aspects, right? Mm-hmm. But I think we will get also to a bit to your question a bit later, because I think we found also a nice correlation with some of Badiou's explanations, and it suddenly makes a bit more sense to me, at least. We propose to begin the kind of interpretation from Marx to a sort of transcendental discussion of this lattice structure we're calling, right, the value transcendental, with this formula here, which is not like Marx's, if you look at it very at first, because Marx does one thing that we are not doing, right? Unlike Marx, we're treating these multiples as not having a separation between quality and quantity. Marx already distinguishes quantity and quality. So for example, he already treats this essence here like corn. There is such a thing as corn. And then there is, or a unit of corn. And then there are many units of corn. So the quantity is here and the quality is here. But because we actually want to explore issues of scale, and because we have the means to accept that the things being mapped in our transcendental might be fuzzy sets, they might, or from the extensional point of view, there's always some quantity. You don't need to define that quantity extrinsically. You don't need to depart from that distinction. You can start from one step before and say something like the exchange function of A and B is to the p degree, right? And you can say that if it's maximal, then they are exchangeable, and if it's minimal, there is no quantity in which they're exchangeable, perhaps. So this is a sort of accidental exchange function, right? So if I have any two things in a world like this, it's not necessary that everything is exchangeable. It might be the case that this is to the p degree, and this thing here is exchangeable to the maximal degree, but nothing guarantees that if I now analyze this thing here, that they are exchangeable in a way that's related to this and this. It might not be the case in the long run, right? It's kind of only in this sort of accidental sense. We're not talking about the value of things, we're talking about just the exchange at first, right? But this already allows us to, so if we correlate this with a certain version of this, right, where what we changed is we moved the equal sign to the exchange, we added these things inside, right, and we are not defining their difference between quality and quantity, and the equal sign goes both to the exchange and to the level in which they're equal, right? So this goes this way as well. And these things go here. We get a sort of just a way of kind of evaluating the exchangeability between things, right? That's all that this function is doing.
This is nice. This is absolutely Bedouin.
And at the same time, this already allows us to do just as from a restriction of it to arrive at what Badiou calls the phenomenal identity, which is, let's say I fixate this formula for A, right? And I want to see all the list of exchange evaluations with all other commodities. So for the commodity A, I'm seeing the exchange ability of it for itself, the value of exchangeability of it for B, the value of exchangeability of it for C, and so on and so forth, right? So we don't call this the exchange value of it because it is local and accidental. We call it the value of it. The appearance of its value is the set of all its evaluations. You can see that this is the restriction we made here, which is a fixation, right, of one of the terms. It's very much like the fixation in this equation of this term and letting this term here change. I'm evaluating always A and comparing it to A, B, C, right? And so on.
So like the total expanded form, right?
The total expanded form, exactly. So, and this makes sense to say that this is kind of like the appearance of the value of this commodity, because it's the value, right, of the commodity that is on this side that appears in the form of this list for Marx. So the value of A is the list of evaluations that we can make on these other things.
And this is then the value that comes out of the function E depends on the transcendental. That basically is the I lost track. Is the transcendental of one of the layers or transcendental of the world?
Yeah, we're just looking at the capital, the value transcendental. We're bracketing the other ones, right?
Right. Okay.
So this is immanent to this differentiation principle here.
So it ties the transcendental to the valuation.
Yeah, this function here, you can see that it is taking two things from the world and mapping it to a value in TC, not to a value in T in general, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, although we could say that this function exists because in the same way we said that TC exists in mode A, B, and C, when those modes are dominant as well, right?
Yeah, this is not capitalist. This is for in TA, TA like this, in a world where the reciprocity organizes. So you have like a settlement with families and households, and you have another settlement here. Like silent trade, where some people come here, they leave one object, then these people come later, and if they want that object, they take it and leave another one for them to take it and assume equality here, right? This is like this. This is valid for here. We will compare the exchangeability of the first element with the second, and I might want it might be exchangeable or not. It's totally accidental. It doesn't require that this is valid for all times. It doesn't give you a standard, right? You're just bringing a surplus.
In this case, the exchangeability is always M.
It might be always M. It might be the case that it's not. Like this tribe here is doing something that is to mock the other.
To their exchange, it's always M. It's like equal amount, like that you take, or maybe it's not M. Like if there is like a bushel of wheat, they may take half of it and then they leave a pair of shoes.
Yeah, but look, this P here is not the price, it's not the amount. This is the likelihood, right?
Yeah, and the important thing is it's ruled by a different logic, right? In gift society, you're thinking like, what is I don't want to be dominated by the other, so I need to give something of equal or greater value. But the value here is nothing like a commodity
Yeah.
valuation.
So yeah, so for in the world of ruled by mode A, inside the settlement, people are exchanging based on reciprocity, right? It's only when they leave this space as a sort of auxiliary mode, so you go to a different layer and you see that things that have some ritualistic value and so on, when produced in surplus, they might lose that value and they can be exchanged in accordance to commodity exchange. So anthropologists show that there is a commodity exchange much before capitalism. It's just accidental. It doesn't give you the global consistency of the world. And here in this case, they're exchanging this as if it's equal to that, right? And nothing, and it is commodity exchange because they don't inquire debts or gift reciprocal relations because of this exchange. So this formula is actually valid outside of the capitalist world. It's valid for TC in general, right? Okay, and can you guys understand why this formula here is kind of equivalent to the total form, right? Fixating this term and having a list here, right, of other ones.
Yeah, but I want to come back to Dennis's comment that I get the universal nature of the evaluation function in this form, but
this is not universal yet.
Pardon?
This is not yet. Universal? No, it might not be. We don't know. It's accidental. Just like the exchange, that formula in Marx is not universal at all. Like it doesn't guarantee that if this is the case and this is the case, it doesn't guarantee that this is the case as well.
Okay, but
right, we're arriving. That's why he says that when you get to the money form, now you can compare all commodities. This is not a given. This is something.
But is it not by universal? I mean, if you write that formula again, so this formula or any of them is for the situation that we are comparing the value of commodities with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So one is used as a subject, the other one as a predicate. But in other modes, like the modes of reciprocity, that is not the formula, right?
No.
Okay. Whereas this evaluation function, you just said, could work in a commodity mode, commodity dominant mode, or gift dominant mode.
Yeah, because under gift dominant mode, there's still commodity exchange, right? Under the dominant mode of gift giving, there's still the subdominant commodity exchange. It might be very restricted, right?
Okay, I didn't mean it in that way. I meant even in TA of TA, T sup A, there is a T sub A, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now in T sub A, the formula XA equal to YB does not exist.
No. You right? Need a different function. You need a reciprocity function, right?
Right. And my understanding was that by generalizing XA equal to YB into this formula, which is E of A and B, we can even say that in T sub A, A comma B still applies. So in that mode, you can basically you can compare the gifts with each other and get a maximal value.
No, I think that it would be good to distinguish that. Like, again, you have objects here, and you're evaluating them in terms of the reciprocal relations, And it might be that they're not, nobody would give this gift to another. But let's say, so this is, let's say they wouldn't give it as a gift and create debt relations and all the reciprocal, the personification relations that come with gift giving. But they might exchange these things as commodities. So the exchange function only defines this layer. There is no sense of talking about the exchange function for this layer. This layer functions according to another sort of evaluation.
I understand, but this is where the component of transcendental, I thought, is coming to this. So you can still write the function EA comma B equal to P, but the fact that it is gift or commodity is because is interpreted according to different transcendentals. So in a world where it's gift based, then EA comma B is the reciprocal handout of gifts. And in that case, the value is always M, because you give one gift and you get another gift. Whereas in commodity, the transcendental is different, but the formula is still the same.
No, I wouldn't go there. I don't think there's any reason. You should substitute this for commodity exchange function.
Okay.
Like this is not the function for every transcendental. We should evaluate and analyze that in detail for reciprocity. I don't think we should assume that it has this structure for.
I thought that you were going that way.
No. I just add the commodity here because.
But you understood what I was.
No, I think I understood it better, but I think we should stop one step before that. Like, we're only bringing the other systems of analysis, so A, B, and D, when they help compose the atoms that we are analyzing from this perspective. And I think that what makes them singular as modes of differentiation should be analyzed in separate, because saying that it is the same function that just has a different value, I think it's saying a bit too much. Like, I'm not sure. I really don't know. Like, I wouldn't. Then anyway, like, I hope that this first step makes sense to you guys, that this is a bit like this with some minor changes. And the big change is that since P is pretty much defining, let's say, the amount of equalness, right? The quantity is actually kind of moved to the equal sign. And you can remove them from here, because in a phenomenological analysis, you don't really, until you're very far into production and circulation, you don't see quantity as separate. Like, if I have 10 coffee mugs, they can be called A. And let's say 3 coffee mugs, they have a very small exchange rate with something. But 10 coffee mugs, A, they exchange. So we're not making the quantity-quality distinction at this level, right? We're allowing A and B to stand in for multiples that might have more or less inside of them.
Yeah, you're actually X and Y is taken out of the formula and is subsumed by the value P.
Yeah.
So the value P is, like, for example, X over Y.
Yeah, we thought about that. We thought about, like, if we shouldn't even write the ratio here, right? So some amount of A over some amount of
yeah,
B.
but I mean,
but there would be a problem with that.
Yeah, I'm not saying a direct one, but because like, one may be weight, the other one may be length. So they don't have the same metric, but it's a generalization of that equation.
Yes, exactly. So it's important also because this for now is the likelihood, right, of exchange. If it's maximal, it's exchangeable. If it's minimal, it's not exchangeable. And here you actually have a longer list than in Marx, because you don't specify x of A already. You have for any x, right? So x of A is A, but y of A is actually B. Z of A is actually C. So different quantities of the same thing are actually different things, right? So we're actually at this level subsuming quantity under quality, and we still are not satisfied in saying that this is a given. To actually make quantity appear as quantity, you need to do more stuff. And I think that that's actually something we didn't discuss that much, but it's actually a very profound result, like a very profound change in perspective, you know? So as we said, like we could, but I don't think we should go into this, and this little asterisk here is to say that we should evaluate this in more detail than we did. But again, the exchange function here, it seems to respect these principles. It's symmetric for accidental exchange, not for a sequence of exchanges. So the exchangeability of A for B and the exchangeability of B for A at the moment of the accidental exchange is the same. And Marx had a problem with accepting the inverse because the predicative structure has very clear different places, right, in the grammar. He couldn't keep the predicative structure and accept symmetry in this way that we did. But for us, I don't think that's a big problem, because we can arrive at the predicative idea that he had with the relative and the equivalent form from a different approach. But these two properties hold for the function itself, for the mappings, E, right? And the relations between the values in the value transcendental, you have a minimum for non-exchangeability. You can talk about conjunction. So what is the common quantity or the common likelihood of exchangeability based on different functions like this? We can talk about envelope and so on and so forth, right?
I also think this leads us to thinking that P is a little more complicated than just likelihood in the sense of like probability.
Yeah.
Right. It's some amount of qualitative information is in this.
Yeah, I think it is like likelihood, but it's actually exchangeability, right?
Yeah, it's exchangeability, and also we can say that the exchangeability of two commodities is actually best represented by another commodity. I think we can make statements like that.
Sorry, say that again. Like the exchangeability of
A and B can actually be personified by or embodied by a third commodity, maybe, which would be the intermediate, which kind of makes sense. Like if I have two commodities, I've never exchanged them before, but I've exchanged A with B and B with C, then I can derive an exchangeability between A and C, but it may not be immediate, right? So I think that's trying to imagine a exchange relation that's not completely transitively closed, although this triangular inequality kind of hints at that, but it's not a complete closure.
Yeah, it's still just partially ordering them, right? There's still a space for disjunction.
Exactly.
So did I understand from the previous formula, the formula, what is, not this one, the list, yeah, the phenomenal identity. Did I understand that, or in the, from the general description, you're basically qualify each quantity of, so for example, let's give a concrete example. Linen, like 1 yard of linen is A and 2 yards of linen is B, 3 yards of linen is C. Is that the case?
Yeah, that could be the case.
Because unless we do that, we cannot replace x a equal to yb with this, right? Because
Yeah.
in here we are losing some information unless we did that.
Yeah, x of a is already kind of, it's already kind of a section of a,
yeah,
right?
we have 4 components in Marx's formula, whereas here we have 2 components. Well, 3 components. So we are losing 1 component. That's why we have difficulty to interpret what P is, because P seems to be fuzzy a little bit, because it has to actually represent a combination of X and Y.
Exactly.
The difficulty with P is that. So one way to do this is to make X of A to an object or to a phenomena.
If you want, you can, because for example, I think one solution for this is to say x of a is actually based on an underlying definition of what a unit is, right? So there is something previously splits commodities between a thing and many things. And you can say that perhaps property does that. When you sign contracts, you define quantities and qualities of things. And then when we exchange A of A for Y of B.
Or maybe we need another function.
But we want to extract, we will arrive at that. I think we are able to recover some of that as we move along as well. That's part of what makes this nice, I think. Marx presupposes that quantity and quality are always clearly distinguishable. And I think that the way we're going over this, we might get to that rather than start from it.
Right. So in the world of phenomenon, okay, I was thinking about like in the world of phenomenon in that use case, you always, when thinking about Rupert painting, in Rupert painting, there is a substance called a column, but a column that is being there. So the color of the column, the size of the column, the location of the column, its relative position with respect to other columns or other objects on the, so it's not, it is the substance column, but in a phenomenal world, which is always which always contains quantification, properties such as that quantification. So perhaps when we talk about linen, it's a substantial form, but when we talk about a world, and in terms of the transcendental, we can say it's only a particular amount of linen, something along that line.
No, of course, this is an amount of, but I think our underlying point is that what Badiou does, for example, even the column example, it's not true that you necessarily see 4 columns or 1 column. Depends on how the object composition happens. You might only see this as one thing, and not as 3 separate things. It's only because you're able to separate this, and this by the phenomenal component analysis that you will say the temple is composed of 3 columns. But you could say it's composed of 4 columns, because this actually is defined as column as well for some other way of slicing it. So, but you arrives at the quantitative distinction once he arrives at the atomic distinction and the component and object distinction. We're prior to that. And in reality, that's sometimes the case. Like,
yeah, I was going to point that out too. In reality, if you imagine not having price, because we take for granted that we live in a world of prices, but if you're forced to exchange, let's say in a really shitty situation where you don't, like, money no longer functions, how do you tell if what the exchange you're making is fair to you? You know, like, are you willing to make this exchange? I don't think you would be saying, well, you wouldn't really be considering quantity as much in that case, like unless it's like big enough to make a difference, right? But like if you're starving, you're forced to exchange something you own for food, whether that's 10 pounds of rice or 11 pounds, like that distinction starts to make less of a difference.
Yeah, it's a fuzzy quantity.
Yeah, it's a fuzzy quantity.
Yeah, and to go back to the rice example, even today you ask for a price, like a, you know, some rice and beans, you don't know exactly the amount of rice. You can have, like, not always the quantity so clear. And I think that deriving the function of quantity as something that makes something appear shouldn't be an axiomatic decision. It should be something you arrive at. And I think that if we move just a bit forward, you will see that this is kind of where we're heading at. So we described so we transformed this into this, and we know we lose something by it, but we also gain something else. Then we define the total form, right? The one with the list on this side, into the value of a commodity and its list of exchange, right? And now
we transformed a matrix into a linear list.
Yeah, we can. Here is just that, right? But or you can even think about it as still as this matrix thing. But now we arrive at we have a very natural way of talking about the inversion. Remember that the universal form is when this thing, the fixed part, is not on the relative side of this equation, right? This is the relative, this is the equivalent. This is worth that, but you fixate the predicate, right? So you fixate what's on this side. And you say everything on this side is this, right? The equivalent side. Well, that's how Badiou defines the phenomenal component function, right? He says you have a predicate and you're going to evaluate how much X, like, so here's a value, how much of belonging it has to this predicate, right? So you're looking for ways of slicing in terms of predicates, these things. So this is how we thought of it. Like you have an A commodity now functions as a predicate. It doesn't function as the thing being evaluated. So you're not fixating it as in this case here, the value of A. You're fixating A as the thing that evaluates other commodities and gives you a degree, which is kind of like saying B belongs to the P degree to the property A. Right? Which is like treating commodity A as a predicate that obtains or not for other commodities. Commodity B might be more or less like A. Right? Not like, right? It's how much it belongs to A, right? Or belongs to the predicate, to the set called, the set whose predicate is A.
Yeah, it's exactly the movement from the identity function in Badiou to components, right? Because we can still rewrite A of B as identity of A and B, or exchange of A and B, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but considered in different kind of registers. But yeah.
So if you now, again, so this is kind of like saying you have this whole list, like Y of B and so on and so forth, and it's expressed in terms of X of A, knowing that in our case, the quantities are actually just thought as the bundle itself, right? The fuzzy quantity. And the question is, well, it might be, it's not accidental because it contains, you can express any commodity in terms of A. So they're all commensurate, but the exchangeability might not be complete, right? It doesn't obtain all the time. But this is, I hope this is clear, that this is like the universal equivalent form, right? Which is the move from this to fixating the predicate. we move to the way that Badiou defines the atom on top of the component, right? Find the case to which, so what is the exact predicate for which something belongs absolutely to it? The case of a commodity A, which functions as a maximal predicate for the expression of value of some other commodity, such that if x of A equals maximum and x of Y equals maximum, then x and Y are equal. So if I can express maximally B in terms of A, and I can express maximally C in terms of A, then B and C are equal in some sense. They're indistinguishable.
Yeah, nice.
Right?
Yep.
So this is the idea that this is the basis for the money form. That commodity that when placed here, any commodity for which obtains maximally, we know that B and C will then be equal. Now, it's nice because there is actually a passage in Marx which shows that if this is the case, there is actually some element, some bodily element M, that will mimic the logical property. So the logical property of the atom actually finds an ontologic support, let's say. I think this passage is very nice when he says this. I think I copied here. He says, the truth of the proposition that although gold and silver are not by nature money, money is by nature gold and silver, is shown by the fitness of the physical properties of these metals for the functions of money. An adequate form of manifestation of value, a fit embodiment of abstract, undifferentiated, and therefore equal human labor, that material alone can be whose very sample exhibits the same uniform quality. On the other hand, since the difference between the magnitudes of value is purely quantitative, the money commodity must be susceptible of mere quantitative differences, must therefore be divisible at will and equally capable of being reunited. Gold and silver possess these properties by nature. So if the money commodity is such that for any commodity that I put here, if it is maximal, then X and Y are equal. I can also say that there exists some substrate that if I evaluate this property, first it belongs maximally to this property, right? And if I evaluate X and Y on it, it holds the whole phenomenal logic, right? And I love this quote because Marx is saying that money and gold and silver are not chosen because they're special in terms of value. They're chosen because their matter, their physical properties, mimic the functions of money, right? I know that if, let's say, a certain amount X of money indexes positively a certain amount X of A, if I have now the half of X, I'll have the half of A, right? So you need to be able to infinitely divide and recompose without loss, right? Sorry, somebody said something here. Yeah, that makes sense to me, Renzo, the way you formulated it. But you see, like, this quote is so sophisticated. He's saying the logical functions of money are such that every sample is uniform to the whole, right? The parts are uniform with the whole. So bits of money are equal to the sum of those parts, right? They must be susceptible to purely quantitative differences. So when I cut those parts, they are made of the same thing as the whole. If I cut, I don't know, a car into parts, the parts of a car are not made of car, right? So gold and silver, they imitate the logical functions that they support, right? No wonder that you can change gold and silver for other things like salt, which was money for a long time, or just credit scores or numbers, because you can divide numbers and multiply numbers and they respect this same properties, right? But they need to have they function as a support. So going back there, I'm sorry. Sorry, yeah, Dennis corrected it, yes. So given that the money predicate has a physical support, right? And that it respects the exchange's functions on it, right? We can also define now that the expression of another commodity in terms of money is its price. And here we added this remark, which I'm not sure what we think about it, but the degree P, in this case, now that it's been fixated and exchangeability is guaranteed once you find the right amount, right? It's not expressing likelihood, because likelihood is guaranteed. But the amount of money needed for the exchange, or the idea that you can actually quantify the likelihood in some sense. What do we think of this, Dennis? I'm not sure if we still agree with this.
Yeah. Right. We know for sure. Yeah. Before, there was a chance that A and B are not exchangeable, no matter how much quantity you have of either. Right. But with the money predicate, it becomes a matter of how much money. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and you have this whole like conflicts here from TA to T, the other transcendentals, right? Like when people say, "Oh, this is not for sale," I'm not going to sell this. You know, it's because they're attached to it in some other way that's not seen by the capitalist.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it couldn't be exchanged in the right proportions. It just means that you don't want to, or that it has some other value, or that you want to deprive the other of it.
Exactly. So you have this closure insofar as like now everything has a price. Everything that the capitalist world considers a thing or it has existence has a price. So yeah, there's a change here, and I think, yeah, I mean the exchange function doesn't obey at the beginning. The exchange function does not obey the symmetry and transitivity. But by the end here, we have that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not guaranteed that in this case, for every A and B, it works, right? But the moment that you find a way to fixate A, and this obtains, so you find the commodity that functions as the predicative, the universal predicate of all of them, meaning that whatever you put here, you will get that they're equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you are guaranteed exchangeability. The only thing that now springs as the possibility of it not happening is if the X, Y, and Z of these things is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in that sense, yeah, we did derive quantity.
Yeah, that's why P is now connected to the quantities, because that's the only thing that can change or not, right? Mm-hmm. That's why I think we wrote here likelihood becomes a quantity. Because if they're not exchangeable, it's because B is in the wrong quantity, right? The proportion is wrong. That's the only thing left to make it not work.
So let me understand it. Somewhere in the formula, when you were doing handwriting, you put a sub for A. So you put A sub X and B sub X equal to M, for example.
Yeah, like this, right?
Yeah, something like that. So I like this, and this is the missing component. So M sub X is the amount. That sub is amount of M, and that sub Y of A is amount of A that gives a degree of exchange between them. something like that.
Yeah, but the point is that this functions without the index, right? And it holds for a change here and a change here. The moment that I change here and I don't change here, and this doesn't hold, I know it's a quantitative discrepancy. This is useful just to think about the fact that these things need to be decomposable. But I think that we want to actually go a step further. We haven't done this yet, but which is to show that once you define, this is not the money commodity. This is not like an amount of coins. This is the coinness of other commodities.
Oh, I thought little m is gold or silver is the ontological
yeah,
thing.
okay, the goldness of things,
Yeah.
right? But the goldness of things is not yet the decomposition of the parts and wholes. So I think we want to arrive at that separately in a way that Marx doesn't do, because it's going to be very useful for us to be able to talk about, let's say, given some commodity C, we know that all the parts of it, how are we going to divide it into parts? Well, in such a way that not only is the whole thing indexable in terms of M, but the parts of it, so the little c's, themselves have price. Which is where your example of the columns comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So quantity is priceable quantity. Quantities that are not priceable do not exist. So 1,000 grains of rice and 999 grains of rice, that difference in quantity in some contexts will not exist, because grains of rice are not indexed by price. If they are, then the quantity exists. If they are not, then the quantity does not exist. So we're actually deriving the qualitative quantitative distinction from the money form. So what we constructed when we arrive at the money atom is the price slicing mechanism, right? Which is actually somewhat clarified, but not very much here, with the problem of localization and so on. So if the money m of x is an atom, we can separate all parts of the object which are common with m of x to the p degree, right? All the parts of a car that costs this much, right? We limit m of x to the degree p, and we can see all the parts that have some price. So we can start slicing things in terms of prices. And if I had some object and I slice it in terms of, I don't know, it's x parts such that m of x, like the localization on a degree p, right? This thing here is itself an atom. So this part will also be a real atom, itself corresponding to an element of the multiple. So not only can I measure commodities with the money form, but I can decompose it into priceable parts. And this is very relevant because commodities are, surely from the standpoint of labor, they are decomposable into, I don't know, things produced, right? I produce, like in a car, I made the wheel, I made the handle, I made the door. But in fact, what you're doing, you're decomposing the car into the parts that were made to have a price, right? So no, you're not decomposing, for example, in terms of the wheel, into the details of the wheel that actually went into the concrete labor process, but are not part of what makes the price of the wheel, right? So in this way, you're actually localizing commodities on its parts and discussing the price composition of commodity.
It's not clear to me. So, for example, the maximal element, should I interpret it when the exchange is completely fair and like according to the market it's adequate, or M is like the maximum quantity of?
Yeah, like I think it's just the matter of it exchanges or not, right? Okay. That's why we started with this, meaning likelihood of being exchanged, right? And then we fixate the property, we fixate a commodity and ask, this is how the component is in Badiou, right? The P degree is actually how much B belongs to the set defined by the predicate A. If it totally belongs to the set, so if it's absolutely identical in terms of A-ness, right? It's like it being exchangeable.
Yeah, so the M, so the maximum is when you got exactly the right exchange according to value. And in this sense, if you change the B for like a lower amount, this exchangeability will become lower and it will track price. So you can use it to recover the real value, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. That's how I understand it. Because I mean, one thing that I think is important that if you think about it, like this is not a convention. This is a commodity object. It has a specific quantity of itself, right? So when you think about it as a commodity, as a money commodity, but the fact that you can evaluate stuff with regards to it doesn't mean that it's out of the world. It's now the embodied reference, right? So we want to, there are cases where if I'm walking around with 10 bucks, there are some stuff that when I ask the question, is X worth 10 bucks? It's not really worth 10 bucks. It's worth less, right? But the fact is that if I now ask like the localization of this amount of money, right, on a lower degree, P, I will get some other amount, some other atom, M line, which is like, it's a new atom, right? Which is like, say, 8 bucks. So if I put right, this is now 8 bucks, and we're looking at things that maximally belong to 8 bucks, like to the set of things that are $8.
Yeah, I think there's maybe some technical things we may need to add. If we wanted to find things, if you wanted to slice up a commodity by things that, or you want to extract the things that are worth exactly $8, you actually need to take the envelope of the conjunction.
Yeah, you're right.
I think the conjunction itself just says at most P.
Yeah,
right?
actually,
So like
it's the Kantian example, right? Like if I have 20 bucks in my pocket, I also have 10 bucks.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You already have a measuring stick that will measure things up to 20 bucks, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but if you wanted exactly something, you would need to use an envelope to create the lower bound as well.
Yeah, actually, to arrive at the specific quantity, you need to go through localization, through compatibility, and actually get to order so you can define the lower upper bound, right?
Yes.
And in a sense, as M becomes like capital, you get to see more of the space, right? Because you're like higher up on the...
Exactly, I think that's where we want to get at. But do you see like...
You can only go down, right? Because it's a conjunction, so you can only...
Yeah, it's true. You can only see the lower common parts.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah, but you know where this becomes like a nice example of localization is if
sorry, just 1 second. Sorry, Dennis. But since the X is not defined, you can actually analyze big parts by changing the X, right? So
you mean like of a big thing, you can find everything that has smaller parts.
Yeah, exactly. Like I can analyze the price structure of a building, of a city, of anything. Like looking at capital is not only looking at big things, but looking in a different way. I think we managed to show that as well. Yeah, but sorry, I interrupted you.
Yes, sir.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, like, if you go to a store and someone is trying to sell you some shoes, and the shoes are very high priced, you might ask the question, why is this shoe cost so much. Like all the other shoes here are like 1/10 the price. And then the salesperson will say, oh yeah, it's made of real leather, or like we imported this thing directly from Japan and it's like, it's one of a kind, you know. But that explanation itself is a localization, right? It's a way of saying that there's a part of this shoe which accounts for the price more than the others. So it's a very practical thing when you're evaluating the value of something. Like the price cannot be unexplainable. That's a rule, right? If you want to sell something to someone, you have to be able to explain why the price is what it is to someone, or it has to be apparent, right? You don't not necessarily have to say it to them, but of course it needs to appear in the world for that transaction to happen.
And I think that this is the main part. Like that's, I think we put an emphasis on the difference between money form and the money commodity. So the actual object that functions as money, because the money form in our reconstruction, it is, let's say, the priceability or the perspective within the value world, which allows you to slice things and slice them in such a way that you're always making their expression in terms of money apparent, right? It's not the same as exchanging, the act of exchange. It's a way of seeing, right? It's a perspective on objects where the whole and the parts are always seen in terms of parts made of price, right? Or seen as price, and wholes seen as price.
Yeah, and this also goes into why, like, 10 grains of rice is no different from 11 grains of rice, right? It does that difference does not appear. What appears, there has to be a scale or a resolution under which the price relation starts to appear.
And I think that this is actually, I'm really, really happy we managed to do this. I mean, I added some, but I think we can skip this for now, because this definition of the money form as separate, so right, as the criteria for slicing objects in terms of priceable parts and priceable wholes, right? It is a transcendental result. It's prior to the exchange, like the circulation, where money is actually in between. It's like a thing that helps you exchange other things, right? And it's between circulation and production. And when you start looking at things in this way, like this object is actually decomposed in priceable parts, like this, right? And so on. You realize that priceable parts are usually, like, they are the outputs or the inputs of the production process. When it is a capitalist production process, right? You produce parts and they count insofar as they can be priced. Nothing, of course, there are ways of slicing the object that don't correspond to their price, right? But those ways of slicing won't help you go back to the production process as seen from the value production aspect. Do you see the point? Like it is like an intermediate step where this could all be called the money perspective, right? When you talk about following the money and all that sort of ideas, where it's not about money as means of exchange, but money as a way of seeing the world, right? This is where we arrive with this. And I didn't even have a chance to discuss this that much with Dennis, but I think that.
But is this money form not also present in Marx?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
But it's
so this logical separation between money form and the actual fact of exchange and commodity is already in Marx.
Yes, but what is not is that it's a big issue. You've seen many quotes we use this far where Marx says things like this thing here. Let me just go back. he says things like, sorry, if we abstract from their use value, what remains is their value. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities is their value. And then he says, how is the magnitude of this value measured? Well, it's measured by the quantity of value-creating substance, the labor contained in the article. The quantity of labor is measured by its duration. In labor time, it's measured in weeks, days, and hours. And then he says, since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents only the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. Like this very famous quote suggests that the common substance, right? When we say something like the money, if this is maximal and this is maximal, therefore A and B are equal. Like Marx always connects this claim to the claim that, well, the substance that allows for this result is the amount of labor that went into A and went into B, right? And then this opens that huge debate we talked about. Is labor determining all of this? Or is labor determined by all of this? So the big issue is labor, so labor hours, the necessary labor time for making something, this average quantity, right? And this indistinct quality of labor, are they ontologically prior and then they kind of condition all of this? So this has ontological priority over this logic, or is the inverse? This comes first, this is what defines capitalism, its value, and so on and so forth, and this kind of conforms labor to this structure. And therefore, labor in capitalism is a logical form specific to this social structure. The way that Marx presents it makes it a bit unclear which of the two interpretations you should have, because he goes from x of A equals y of B to saying that x of A equals y of B because there is some socially necessary labor time that went into making x of A and making y of B. And because they have the same, they can be exchanged by the same. Like the quantities are fixed, the magnitudes. And what we can do on our perspective is take a third option, which is neither the ontological on top of the logic, nor the logical derivation of labor, but talk about this as this principle of priceable parts, that if you look at the composition, it gives you a perspective on the production process. And if you look at the composed objects, you see the circulation, right? And abstract labor becomes the sort of what the compositional activity is seen, how it is seen in terms of priceable objects, right? When you look at the activity of creating stuff in terms of creating things that have prices, and you ask about the prices, the price of creating them. So you localize not only so you have an object and you have here its parts that went into its production, and you ask about the very labor that turned them, and you ask about its own value, right? You can actually see both paths at the same time. Labor hours are the measure for socially necessary labor time because you buy commodities, labor commodities in the market, and you slice them up in priceable parts. What are the priceable parts of the labor commodity? Are labor hours. Right? So actually the money form goes here and here. Like it allows us to differentiate these three things without going to a weird ontological excursus about labor and so on. So it keeps all the concepts, I think, and you can distinguish them, but it doesn't imply that labor is qualifiable in terms of hours by nature, right? Like I have X of L, and this is hours, and this is labor. This is only the case because when I have the labor commodity and I slice it in terms of money, the parts of labor that are commodified, that are priceable, are the hours. But there might be other things that are priceable in labor, which actually, that does happen, right? So I'm not sure if this part makes sense, and I didn't discuss it that much with Dennis, but I think it's crucial. So then we can define the commodity form with all of this, right? Given a multiple plus this exchange function on that multiple, such that all its components are localizable by the money form, that gives you a commodity, right? It is a multiple, C. I know that it's mappable into the transcendental of value by the function E, and I know that I can slice its parts in a consistent way using the money atom.
Yeah, this is really good. I agree with this.
And I think that
just to say, I think because people have to go already, and I don't think we'll have time to finish the whole thing. Maybe we should find after this next slide, maybe we should stop, because I think it's good. It's a good place to.
Yeah, I agree. Before
can't we extend this for another meeting?
Like yeah, I think that works. For me, it works.
Yeah, that's great. So I have the time to also actually reread the Capital first chapter and all that. So
yeah, so we actually to arrive at where we arrived, it's pretty much we're starting to get into chapter 3.
Okay.
But what I think is, so we arrived, actually all of this here is chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
And a bit of chapter 2, but actually then this here is chapter 2 all the way to chapter, I think, 6, and this is chapter 7 a bit later. But what I just wanted to make sure that one thing is clear that I think is very good is that once we went from value discussion and we went all the way to this money form as a sort of kind of perspective for slicing things in terms of parts, of priceable parts, right? But I think I still think that this is a very profound result to say that if I have a commodity and if I can splice it into parts, right? So like this. So if I have a commodity, I can localize so a part C of M, a part C line of M. And even though we haven't even gotten to the analysis of production, this is already a basic matrix, right? So that's the whole part analysis is already kind of preparing the ground for how you would see an input-output structure.
Yeah, the idea of a production of priceable parts. So you're already embedding
exactly
part of the commodity in the price they would have. Yeah.
Exactly. So just to tell you what we're pretty much going to do next is that we're going to show that the functions of money that Marx describes, they all fit into the structure of a relation. So now we have objects relating, and money is the only object that sees every relation. So we prove the idea of universal exposition of the value transcendental through the money object. Money is the only object that sees any relation between two commodities, right? We can show this very nicely. Then we started developing the idea of just to go to what Renzo said, so capital as something that sees the relation between two spaces of equivalent exchange. And I think that we had some nice results with this. And then we go totally bonkers. You will see.
Part.
Yeah. And this crazy part on labor and stuff we're still working on, actually.
Good material for discussion.
Yeah, it will be. So the more you guys can read from Capital, I think it helps.
Yeah, no, that's great. I wanted to get into that anyway, so it will be quite appropriate now.
Also, if you guys want, I did something very crazy, which is a while back. Let me just see if I can find it here. A while back, I did this. I can send it to you if you want the link. Let's see if it opens. Like I'm not sure if you can see it. I like separated all the chapters from all the volumes of Capital into like a thing like this. Fuck.
Mm-hmm.
If it shows, it would be nice, but apparently it's not. And it's linked, so you can actually go to the chapters.
Oh, that's great. Yes.
See, so from book to book and so on. And
Oh, this is great.
yeah, so I'll just send it to you guys if you want.
Yeah,
so if you click on something, it actually opens the link, for the chapter.
Sounds good. That's excellent.
Yeah, that's so useful.
Anyway.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I don't know why we thought we would be able to go through 63.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this is quite, no, it was quite obvious that it wouldn't happen today.
Yeah, the moment we started speaking, I was already like, okay, this is.
We were on slide 10 for like an hour or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is why I'm thinking like 2 more meetings, or at least something like that, if you want to really cover the whole thing up.
Yeah, I also think that
I have to go, guys.
Okay.
See ya.
See you, my friend. If you guys want, we can do it. We don't have a plan for the next Monday meeting, so we could, for example, do one Monday, one to next Tuesday, so we can.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. This is great. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Great. So we can pick it
Good
up
meeting.
next time. Guys, see you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.